thank you and good evening. And yes, I bring hopefully Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen together in this discussion. It's something I've been diddling away at, this particular thing, for about 12, 13 years. And suddenly last year I realised really a centenary is something I ought to do something about. So we've almost made that. So we've almost made the centenary. Some of you may know the exhibition from 2 volumes looking like this that are in many, many libraries. I only brought one down by train. One was heavy enough. And this is, the core of what I've been looking at. But to get on with it, there were a number of exhibitions in Glasgow, and following on obviously from the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. The 1888 exhibition in Glasgow was followed by one in 1901, and that 1901 exhibition was perhaps the largest exhibition, certainly of its period in Britain, with over 11.5 million visitors to it over the summer of 1901. And it had a historical section in a mock-up of a tower house in the exhibition. There also were exhibitions in Edinburgh, which I haven't studied at all. There was a 1908 exhibition focusing on Scottish history in Edinburgh, and that was one of the inspirations for the Glasgow exhibition. One of the reasons I became interested in this is because it's an exhibition that was put together one summer, drawing on material from all over the country. So unlike the work I'm used to, where you work with a museum collection that's been built up over decades or centuries, here they were able to choose what they had in their display. So it's a wonderful snapshot of what they thought was important at the time. And that's what I think is the greatest value of looking at this, is trying to understand what Scottish history was in 1911. So there had been an growing interest in Scottish history at the turn of the century, and it had led to a desire to establish a chair of Scottish history in Glasgow University. And the Glasgow Burns Club in 1907 had set up a campaign to try to raise money, but the Burns Club seemed to have been remarkably ill-networked and managed to get something like £700 was their achievement. So after the 1908 exhibition in Edinburgh, there's nothing more likely to inspire Glaswegians to do something better than if Edinburgh's done it. They decided to draw together this idea of a Scottish exhibition with a chair of Scottish history. And so in 1909, a little group of notables in Glasgow decided to run an exhibition that would raise the money to endow a chair. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. You'll see some of the things I'm talking about come through about the importance of all the social networks behind this and the people they drew on. So the Trades House was very, very influential. There were Highland societies, patriotic societies, that sort of world were the people who were behind it, but I'll come back to that later. And it was successful. There's some dispute over whether it had more or fewer visitors than the 1901 exhibition. The figure quoted is slightly lower, but there again, they didn't count all the attendance. So I think they argued they were more popular. Obviously, the thing that happened after 1911 was the First World War, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why this is not really a very well-known exhibition. And the later one, 1936 Empire exhibition, is famous. The Scottish Screen Archive has got lots of little bits of video or colour film of it. It's quite well known. It's still within living memory. So hopefully you're reading some of these things as I'm talking. There's going to be quite a few words on the screen. I'm going to try not to read the words on the screen as we go through this evening. So what I'm saying is, maybe less important than what I've written. I want to start by sort of taking you on a virtual tour of the exhibition. It was held in Kelvin Grove Park in the West End of Glasgow, and this photograph is taken from Glasgow University Tower, looking over Kelvin Grove Park. It's astonishing. You can go and visit Kelvin Grove Park now, and you can hardly see any trace that this was ever here. And indeed, by 1912, there was almost nothing left. This is a temporary structure. And unlike many of the other great exhibitions, this one didn't have a single big building, but had a whole series of buildings dotted around the park. And so it was accepting the existing park layout, the paths that were there before or the paths that are there now. So it was fitting in with the park. And as I say, they were temporary structures. It's hard to believe that they were temporary as you see them, but indeed they were. Like many great exhibitions, it had the core themes of industry and empire at its heart. But this one is unusual because it also brought on the idea of it being a national exhibition rather than an international exhibition, which is more a claim of international importance, whereas this was saying it had a national scope. It was focusing on Scottish history and identity. Like many other exhibitions, there are sort of two strands to it, and remembering back to what I was saying, the twin aims of it were to raise money to endow the chair and to have an exhibition related to history. People knew the bit that made the money was the entertainment section. That's what many, many people went to go to. And then there was the educational bit, the cultural bit, the bit that gave it the status and the visitors the status. So there's that split going on here, but perhaps slightly less of a split than in some of the other exhibitions. It's been noted that in the Paris exhibitions in the round about 1900, 1889 and 1900, that they had a reconstruction of old Paris, and there's a historical bit coming through there, and there's a sense in which visiting reconstructed buildings is entertainment. So it's not quite that absolute duality. So this is the view of the whole exhibition, and I hope you can see, I mean, if you know Glasgow, that's Park Circus there, and then Kelvin Grove Museum is here. That was built following, as part of and following one of the previous exhibitions. So, go on a walk. That's the main gate, and I've put a photograph on the left of what it looks like today. It was quite frustrating actually going around Kelvin Grove Park taking these photographs, and there's nothing really to show, but you'll get used to them. So, quite a striking entrance. I say again, it's temporary. It's not meant to last. And from there, I've highlighted it in blue, but you can see in the middle of the blue there's a little X, because on the original plan this is highlighted as the place to start. And the suggestion is that at not busy times you could sit down there and look at the plan and decide what you're going to do. The spot actually is the Stuart Memorial Fountain, and this is a memorial to Loch Katrine water supply into Glasgow, which was very important to Glasgow, and I think the choice of it as the orientation point for the exhibition isn't accidental. It's something that emphasises the importance and success of municipal endeavour in Glasgow. It emphasises engineering achievement. At the same time, and you'll catch this reference later, Loch Katrine, Lady of the Lake, Walter Scott, Romantic Highlands, it's a connection to that part of Scotland with this engineering progress as well. So it is a wonderful central figure for the exhibition, and it survives. It was there before the exhibition, and it survives today. So if we turned right, we go into this end of the park, which is now really dull. It's sort of kickabout pitch, and that's about it. The photograph I really carefully took from the same direction. It was very difficult to line it up because there are so few markers. I'm not going to look at these buildings in detail. There's one I want to concentrate on later. It's the Palace of History. But the Kelvin Hall on the right is named the Kelvin Hall really after Lord Kelvin rather than after the River Kelvin. So there's a two-step there to the river. And it was essentially the Palace of Engineering, and was the place where all the engineering in the west of Scotland was able to show its wares. So it was local. It wasn't an international pavilion, this one. And then turning back a bit, this is the Palace of Industry, and in here it was a much bigger building, so it had a machinery hall, but it also had the colonial, exhibitions, the stands from the different colonies. Moving on a bit further into the exhibition, this is the looking over the pond, which was there, is there, was called the Duck Pond, still has ducks. Looking up towards Park Circus on the horizon, but this amazing white structure was the Garden Club, which included a tea room run by Miss Cranston, with the menu designed by, I think, Margaret MacDonald, Macintosh. So there's a sort of Macintosh feel comes through in this section. The rest of the buildings you can see are very much a sort of pastiche Scots baronial. And it's interesting, sort of little Macintosh hint into it. And then moving up to the far end of the park, you notice this is the far end, it's the common bit, it's the entertainment section. And the entertainment section had quite a number of different sections. And to quote, it included the Joy Wheel, the Aquarium, the Joy House or Hall of Illusion, and the African Village. The Joy Wheel, I checked this out, was a particular bit of circus equipment which was basically a rotating disc which you sat on the middle of, and it got faster and faster, and then you get thrown off. And so people stood around the edge and laughed at you. So it was of the moment, 1909, 1912. It was I think actually maybe 1910, 1911. It really was the trendy thing of the moment. It's interesting though that you have a variety of things in the entertainment section, and I'm showing you the three most popular. The Mountain Scenic Railway, which is quite stunning construction, and it attracted 1,285,000 visitors, or at least goes on it. And then slightly further up, there's the West African Village, which was the second most popular attraction in the entertainment section. It was next door to a Sami village, a Lap village, or I think they had some reindeer there as well. Now, I'm slightly mystified by this. I've not managed to find out much about it. That why they had these two groups of exotic people, one from the Arctic, one from the tropics, which does sort of give you a sense of the whole world, neither of which are British colonies. I'm quite intrigued by that, what it was. And I'm assuming that they're actually basically almost a travelling troupe that worked their way around different exhibitions, that it was commercially organised, this entertainment section. I think that shows the commercial intent of the entertainment section, rather than it being part of the imperial section, where it would have been in the Hall of Industry. The West African Village attracted 900,000 visitors. I mean, they're phenomenal numbers, and this is just the summer. Well, from I think it's May to September. Also, Antiquaries, a Highland village, which I emphasise is part of the entertainment section. And going from the African village, the Sami settlement, to the Highland Clachan, there's a real sense that this is, a look from the civilised world at the uncivilised. It attracted 700,000 visitors, so it's the third most popular part of the entertainment section. It made quite a play, and I'll return to this about authenticity, so that they employed Gaelic-speaking Highlanders, authentic Gaelic-speaking Highlanders. They had Highland home industry sales. It was making money. It was trying to build up that idea of craft sales from the Highlands as being the future for the Highlands. And Neil Munro, who wrote the guide to it, described these as remnants of ancient folk. So it was a survival from the past of something rather exotic, and we're very fortunate we're able to see it. And so you had two different attitudes come through in reading the accounts of visitors. On the one hand, you have people who say things like they were able to pry into the life of the humble cotter, so there was a sense of the observer from outside. And then other people, basically other Gaelic-speaking Highlanders, who talked about the warm handshake and sitting around the fire chatting to people, the informal céilles, the way some of the Highland societies started having meetings there during the summer. So it took on a separate life from the people who were there, as distinct from the original intent, which was just to look at it. And there were disputes later on in the exhibition, people trying to get cheap entry to it because they were Highlanders, and they thought it was their world. For people coming to the Mod, they should get in cheaply, and no, because this was about raising money. It was the entertainment section, don't forget it. It was popular. 1936, the same designer created a very similar thing in Bellahouston Park, as part of the Empire exhibition. And it's the only thing that actually leaves a memorial in the park, that there's this stored a mould for making a cruisie, which may have been used during the exhibition as part of the crafts, I don't know, or it may just be a symbolic thing. I note here, and you'll see it later, the lack of Gallic culture in the Palace of History. One of the things that does come up is Ossian, and they made quite a show of translations of Ossian into English, into Italian, into Norwegian, into Swedish, showing the international importance of Gallic culture, but still you have the feeling that it's sort of a marginal part of what real Scottish history was about. The Old Tune was part of the historical section. So here you've got a very similar feel, or a pastiche of something, and yet this was Scottish history. And I think it emphasises the view of history that the organisers had. This is history. Anclachan is a surviving primitive world. It was peopled by actors, dressed up. No pretense of authenticity here. Though the buildings were reconstructions of a number of, once that had been knocked down in Glasgow, a number of old buildings that survived in the Gorbals and had been demolished fairly recently, and they were reconstructed here. There was also a procession of ships in the River Kelvin, and I'm slightly unclear, but some accounts talk of this procession of ships as if it's something that moved, but one photograph I've seen shows an oily, disgusting Kelvin with some sad boats moored in it, so I think some of it was in the imagination. The ships incidentally ranged, there was a historical sequence from a coracle up to a dreadnought, all Scottish built. So I think this is a really important point with those two sections, Anclachan and the Old Tune. The place was important, that it was in Calvin Grove. You could have held a Scottish history exhibition in Glasgow Green. Glasgow Green had a lot of historical events taking place, including James Watt and the discovery, invention, whatever we call it, of the steam engine, and the Chartist campaigns. And that maybe was one of the things that counted against it. It was in the dirty East End, not the nice West End. It was a bit political, whereas the West End is much more comfortably bourgeois. Calvin Grove has this aura of the song, "Let us haste to Calvin Grove, bonny lassie o," and not singing. In the guide, they talk about the Gaelic derivation of the name Kelvin as Cuilavin. I've no idea whether that's true or not, but they were playing on that sense. Here's an authentic place. But it's hidden in amongst the trees, and maybe one of the reasons for that was just to cut it off from the rest of the exhibition. But it's pastiche. If you look very closely, you might or might not make it out, up on the wall there, I don't know if you can see that there are sort of white lines, square. These walls are made out of sections of cast plaster that were then mounted on a frame. And so the photographs taken later in the exhibition, you can see the cracks showing. The backdrop, literally, was a backdrop. It was a painted screen. There's a lovely little cartoon referring to the 1936 exhibition, which shows the Bruins and Grandpa Brune rowing through the painted screen at the back, that suddenly reality impinges. There's also a photograph of the exhibition in which they painted out a tenement and a church that intrude in the background to make it more authentic, more like the authentic Highland village. And notice there this reference to Loch Katrine, that it's scientific, it's modern, it's authentic in its reconstruction of this lost romantic world. And finally, the Palace of History, which is what I really want to concentrate on. It was built around the remains of the old Kelvin Grove house, which had been used in the museum and was completely demolished after this exhibition, and it was mocked up to look like Falkland Palace. So the towers nearest us are built around the old stone building. The rest of the building is all just a sort of steel shed with a facade to make it look a bit older. Described, I think, as a jewelled casket. I was quite interested. I'm not going to make any comments about the museum that way, but I did a while ago think about how this compared with the Museum of Scotland, and it was interesting architecturally how some of the references in the Museum of Scotland are to a keep, to a castle, to to something containing priceless relics. And there's that same sort of referencing going on here, though this was done in a form of pastiche, whereas in the late 20th century nobody would do anything as common as that. Yeah, so looking into the exhibition, this is the plan. You can see that's orientated so that the old part is at the top of the screen. There was no, from what I can make out, no formal route around it. You could come in either the entrance there, or there were two entrances down here. So there wasn't a single routeway, but there was a sense in which you either came in down here, past historical portraits, personal relics, or up here with this material to do with the church and heraldry. So this one gives you a sort of historical narrative, and this one tells you what's important in Scotland. The central part was much more permeable. You could move from gallery to gallery. And then there's a separate prehistory section. Now, I still am confused by the layout. I still can't really make a lot of sense of it. And there were complaints from visitors at the time that the cases weren't numbered, there weren't routeways, it wasn't clear what to do. It was a bit of a mess. And I think it was a bit of a mess. I think they ran out of time, and it was a bit of a rush at the end to fit things in. But you can pick out some patterns within it that I think are interesting. One of the things to note here is this association of weapons and military, and then the Swedish and Netherlands and French sections, is because it's emphasising the role of the Scots soldier. So there is a linkage in some of this, in the way that the gallery here, there's a sort of sense here of what we might now talk about social history. They called it ethnography. So there's some scary graphs to make it look scientific. I can't give you a fountain, but I can give you a graph. So I've highlighted some. These are very crude figures taken from not the number of items. I couldn't do that. I couldn't face going through this counting the number of items, but the number of page references to different things. So it's a crude measure, but it shows the yellow line and is prehistory. The small yellow line is the Romans. So that's the sort of archaeology bit. How important this was, numerically at least. Notice the importance of ecclesiastical things, of the church, the bright green, I think it is. So church history comes through, quite important. And then things to do with individuals. So that's the pinky purple, where either historical portraits or seals and so on, so things to do with the individual. So you begin to get a picture here of what was mattering to them, what were the things they had lots of. So now it's how we look at within the exhibition. I mentioned the historical portraits being a very important part of it. So this is one of the entrances. You came in via the sense of great men, and it was arranged chronologically. And the idea, as it says here, is that they tried to associate the portrait with the relics. And that's quite a contrast with the Museum of Scotland, where things as relics weren't really selected. There was actually a common thing that David Hume's watch tells you nothing about David Hume. Whereas here they were feeling that the relic, the association with the great man, there was a magic to it. And that was definitely a design approach of 100 years ago and not of a present-day museum. Some particular individuals are highlighted in the contents page, are really pulled out as being very important, and these basically are they. So we still recognise them as important people. I wonder how many people would be as aware of Alan Ramsay and Marcus of Montrose now as would have been in 1911. And I mention down at the bottom the Lubeck letter. Again, it reminded me of the arguments in the Museum of Scotland. This, why is Wallace not present? Because there ain't anything of Wallace's. But the Lubeck letter is as near as you get, and so it keeps popping up when people want to do exhibitions. I mean, it's popped up again now. You know, we're going to having it on display in Edinburgh. But there were complaints, and I've just put a bit of the quote here, complaining that it was hidden under a bit of cloth that you had to live up, it wasn't obvious, and yet it was so important. There's this sense of visitors had opinions, and the letter to the Glasgow Herald are a wonderful source for this exhibition. Then, to highlight probably the most important person, if it's not already come through at the time, was Sir Walter Scott. He definitely comes through as the most important historian. He's starting to get a sense he's the most important Scot. In the range of paintings is said to be till Walter Scott. He then writes it down, and it then, it's a different world after Scott from before Scott he could write about. This painting was given the place of honour. So his view of history is profoundly important through the exhibition. I don't think, I could emphasise it enough, but I'm not. Another important section is the Heraldry Section. I say this is the one that in the other main entrance is the main thing you'd encounter, but not just within the gallery. And same, it's not just within the one part of the gallery. There are a number of points where you see bits of heraldry appearing, but also throughout the grounds. And as the quote says, there were lots and lots of saltires and lions rampant flying around the grounds. Though do notice there that it's not just, there's also Union Jack. So I think this emphasis on heraldry and royalty is very important. And rather interestingly, there was one item lent by the Scottish Patriotic Association, which one item doesn't really matter. What's more significant is that the secretary of the exhibition was the president of the Scottish Patriotic Association. So this was him getting it in, and the thing that he put in was this medal about Edward VII being actually Edward I of Scotland, which obviously really bothered people. It happened again, when the present Queen was crowned, the dispute whether she should be E2R or and that's why post boxes in Scotland have just a crown on them, with the compromise that we don't mention the two. And I was very pleased. Hume Brown's Short History of Scotland, he really was the sort of popular historian of the first half of the 20th century. His book was read in schools. It was the dominant textbook. And I love the way that in the appendix he gives the list of monarchs and ends with Edward I, 7th of England. So this is the attitude, this is where they were. I mentioned the importance of church history, and I have a lovely quote, I couldn't quite believe it. I don't think this is one that anybody would say today. This is a visitor writing an essay, and it was a prize-winning essay. It was one of the newspapers had a competition, and this was the prize-winning essay. And this boy said, "All that is Scottish in us is thrilled by the cases of ecclesiastical antiquities." The exhibition says how important the church was in Scottish history. Highlights particularly the 17th century. But what it also tells us is how important the church was in 1911. And I think it's quite interesting, you look around museums today about Scottish history, books about Scottish history, you do not get this dominance of church history. Scottish church history is immensely complicated, and we just don't talk about it nearly as much. So I think this is very, very important. The main person responsible is here Professor Cooper, who was Professor of Church History in Glasgow University. He worked alongside Frederick Eales, who is another important church historian. So they were the two most important people. Still their writings are significant in church history. He was born in Elgin and was minister of St Nicholas Kirk in Aberdeen for 17 years, was very popular, and then moved to Glasgow to be Professor of Church History. He was renowned for being high church, and there was a lot of sniping at him that here he was in the Church of Scotland as Presbyterian, but everybody suspected he actually would quite fancy being bishop. And there's an undercurrent there, but that they chose him and he was doing it shows, I think the quote I put there does show his feeling about the Reformation. There's a lot more I could have said. And then there's this fascinating bit. There were 7 books to do with Catholicism. You saw the size of that graph. Lots and lots of church history mattered. And then at this point, for some time after the Revolution, they were very active in Scotland. This is in Glasgow, west of Scotland, heart of Catholicism in Scotland. Don't talk about it. I'll come back to that. The Prehistoric Gallery might be quite interesting for antiquarians. The person behind this was Ludovic McClellan Mann, who Graham Ritchie spoke about and wrote in the proceedings. And he's shown that in Mann's early years, he was a very effective popularizer, very active, and very keen on good work, good solid work. Later on in his life, he definitely became sort of opposition to the establishment and was generally regarded as loony. But he was very keen on trying to make this gallery something better, something new. So there are lots of models and reconstructions, and through the couple of years of planning of the exhibition, they went out and excavated sites in order to get the real soil so they could reconstruct the sites with the soil. Now, he followed this up with, he worked in Kelvin Grove Museum, did some of the display there. He also did the exhibition in the Empire Exhibition 1936. And I remember until Kelvin Grove was modernised, in the Prehistory Gallery there was a section that showed a number of cinerary urns in a row, and it was sort of sloping case, and they all looked so they're set into a bit of brown soil. Now, I'm not claiming that actually was him, but it goes back to that display approach. So really quite influential there. 40% of the items in the display were actually his. And there was, I think he was being offered money to sell them during the exhibition. He didn't. They ended up in Kelvin Grove. The Glasgow Museum's collections have his material. So he, unlike the rest of the exhibition, this one has a clear order. You can see round the wall. I mean, unfortunately, there's no better photograph than this, so I can't read them. But there are these big panels, 16 big text panels. Really not bad. You look at the number of words, size of print, all the things that museum people are meant to like. And intriguingly, 4 of the 16 refer to the sort of post-glacial period, to the Mesolithic, which at this period wasn't very popular. So he was emphasising that. This is really quite innovative. But move on. There were these 4 sections which relate to Scotland's relationship with other countries. It's France, Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands. What's missing? England, Ireland. England is completely and utterly absent. No reference whatsoever. Other than, within text it is, but there's no objects, no section related. For Ireland, there was actually a wee group of Irish cottages, but they seem to have been a sort of commercial arrangement. They were, selling Irish produce, and that's about it. There's also, for a Norwegian section, there's not a reference to what happened in Norway 6 years before Norwegian independence. And you would have thought that would be in the minds of people, but that was obviously not seen to be particularly relevant. So I'm clearly picking up here some of the the clear politics that there are behind this, but it is often absence rather than presence that gives the game away. So I've done this rough analysis of who the lenders were, and this is them in rank order. Who gave the most objects. And people who are familiar with archaeological collections in Scottish museums will recognise some of these names as important donors. So Ludovic Mann, gave his stuff to Glasgow museums. Charles Whitelaw was very important collector and writer about Scottish weapons, and I think his collection ended up in Glasgow. Henderson Bishop separately catalogued the Hunterian Museum. One of my very first jobs was cataloguing the Bishop collection of Scottish prehistoric material. Eales, Rice, Tom Scott, they're names that you recognise. And it is interesting the way these things were private loans, these were in private hands rather than where they are now, that there's a much higher proportion nowadays in museums than there was at this period. And you can see the split, how important they are for how individuals were, and of the institutions, how many institutions were not museums that had this stuff. Though I'm including there things like there were so many books in the exhibition, for example, that would not normally be in a museum. Another way of looking at the lenders is just skimming through, seeing what kind of person they were. Now, you'll see none of these names cropped up in that first list I showed you. So these people weren't lending much, and indeed some of them, it was an individual thing they lent. There's even the extent that the Marchioness of Tullibardine lent one object, whereas the Duke of Atholl lent quite a few. And the Marchioness of Tullibardine was the daughter-in-law of the Duke of Atholl. And I get the feeling there that it was one of the things from Blair Castle, and I think she was given it to lend so that her name would appear in the list of lenders. And you'll see why she was picked up later on. And I think this is what they're doing. They're trying to pull in the aristocracy, trying to show how well connected they are and their status. And they make quite a play, obviously, with things borrowed from His Majesty the King. What's lacking, of course, is anything from the National Museum. And at first I assumed it was a Glasgow-Edinburgh enmity thing, that nobody would let it out of Edinburgh, but that was just my prejudices. And it showed that just at that point the society believed it wasn't allowed to lend anything. Presumably that attitude has been revised at some point, because the museum readily lends things. But the society was actively involved. Two of the honorary curators of the museum, who were Graham Callender and James Curl, were involved in both lending things and in designing the exhibition. And I was rather pleased to see one of my predecessors, Thomas Bryce, Vice President of Society, he was also active. So the society was involved, but not by lending things. And then there were certain other cases where, for particular reasons, people wouldn't lend things, like here. Like we have again, I noticed the dates changed slightly, that St Andrews is acting on a slightly different foundation date now for its anniversary than it did in 1911. And then to think about where they're coming from, and it's a pretty broad spread. I mean, it genuinely was national, though do note the lack of stuff from the Highlands. I've called it North, includes a pitiful amount from Orkney. You could tell where this exhibition was held, more from Glasgow and the west of Scotland than anywhere else, but quite a significant amount I'm interested in from the northeast. So, because I'm in Aberdeen, I thought I'd have a wee look at that as a sort of case study. So let's just graph them. I'm not looking at these graphs in any detail. Just to note, the group on the left are the institutions, and the group on the right are the individuals. So again, it shows unusually the importance of certain institutions. I mean, say the general picture was for individuals to be more important. Sorry, you're all having to twist your necks. And I'm pleased to see how important the University of Aberdeen was in lending things, particularly if you add together the two columns that relate to it. The library was treated separately. And I think there are probably two reasons for that. One is Professor Cooper, that having been in Aberdeen, he knew what was in the university library, what was in the diocesan library, and he borrowed a lot for his section there. The other thing is that the museum which I'm responsible for, which at that date was called the Museum of Anthropology in the university, had been refounded in 1907, and in 1912 a catalogue was published. So I'm assuming that the collection was at that point quite well known. The curator was a professor of anatomy, was probably quite well connected trying to find out about the collection. And so I think that led to it being lent. I think it also shows a willingness of certain individuals to lend things and to find out what there was. Seeing who the organisers are, this is a photograph taken from Scran. It shows the Lord Provost on the left, and in the centre the Duke of Connaught, who was Queen Victoria's son. And you notice in his left arm he's wearing a black armband, and that was mourning for King Edward the First, 7th. And this is taken in Kelvin Grove Museum in the art galleries next door. So, but you can see in here, this is an unusual glimpse of some women. There were, out of over 100 people involved in all the historical committees, there were 5 women. There was a separate ladies' committee which was chaired by the Lady Provost, who I assume is the solid-looking woman on the right, just to the right of her. And then there was a ladies' welfare committee, which was chaired by Mrs. Pettigrew, and that's her, and then Mr. Pettigrew's there. So they tended to be wives. There's a lovely bit where there are 2 women who were responsible for the sort of needlework section. They did it together, and their husbands were responsible for the Freemasonry section. So you see people, just a few people, that's 2 out of 5. And the Ladies' Welfare Committee was responsible for the welfare of the female attendants of the exhibition. But to pick up, I think, who are the 4 key people in all of this, there's the person who was, in a sense, the honorary president of the exhibition. And I mentioned the Marchioness of Tullibardine. This is her husband, who later became the Duke of Atholl. He had been a very prominent soldier in the Boer War, and was very prominent, very active. And you can see here part of his prominence was political. He was a Conservative MP, had just won the seat in 1910. There were 2 elections in 1910, and he won in both of them. And it's interesting that they actually say a keenly fought contest. There's no pretense that often when we talk about MPs and MSPs, once they've been elected, we just, there's a bit of a sense in which, yes, they just are. We don't think of them quite in that sort of, political way once they're in office. Here they're actually still saying, and the person he defeated was a Liberal. So that's important. I notice he was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge. So in terms of social connectedness, I think he's top of the list. And the person who said this bit about his eminence and his political, being on the right side, was Andrew Pettigrew, who we'll come on to, who was convener of the executive committee, who was the one who actually ran it. Pettigrew was proprietor of Pettigrew and Stevens, which I think did that become Arnott's in Glasgow. House of Fraser swallowed it up. It was one of the big department stores in Glasgow. And he was a former Conservative councillor as well. So this was a period when the Liberal Party had split in the late 19th century into the Liberal Unionists and the Liberals, and this was basically arguments about Irish Home Rule, and so the Liberal Unionists were opposed to Irish Home Rule, and by extension weren't too keen on Scottish Home Rule either. And they ended up the following year, 1912, the Liberal Unionists and the Conservatives merging into what became the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. But it's interesting, these people are on the Conservative side of that. This was the more aristocratic side, definitely businessmen. And then the convener of the Historical Committee, Professor Glaister. Now, in a sense, why would the Professor of Forensic Medicine and Public Health be doing this? He had an amateur interest in archaeology, but you can see, his politics again come clearly. He was very active in the Conservative Party, and I think this is where this is one of the ways in which they knew each other, and where they shared a common view of what Scottish identity should be. And finally, the Secretary of the Historical Committee, and as secretaries in the North East section, I think secretaries are really important. And I've mentioned already he was president of the Scottish Patriotic Association. And this quote gives you a sense of what bothered them, what drove them. This idea of Edward the First or Seventh, of having the right form of the royal arms for use in Scotland. This royal heraldic, quite romantic view of Scottish history was very important. But he obviously, this is him writing in his memoirs, it's like uncovered because of the people who started associating with it, and he was trying to distance himself from them, describing them as cranks. So finally, just to pick up a few of the themes of the exhibition that I think therefore come through when he's having this background of who they were, you can see some of the aspects of Scottish history that mattered. So I'm going to have to read quickly. There's a sense here, talking about the Jacobites, of a tremendous respect for royalty and for moderation. So he's called Prince James Francis Edward Stuart. No truck with calling him King James the Eighth and Third. So they've made a decision there, anti-Jacobite in the way they're writing this, the old Chevalier. But there's a tone there that, you know, that he was moral and religious and labouring, but then there's this bit about sort of that he got it wrong. He was a Catholic. You know, Catholicism is something that is just not quite right. Poor him. The second was an astonishing quote that is from the description of a painting of the Battle of Culloden that was in display in the exhibition. And here this sort of vituperative quality comes through that is quite unlike, most of the captions are quite measured and calm. And these are people who are immoderate. Is one thing honestly holding to a cause, like James. It's another thing being a rebel. And I do wonder whether part of this, you know, is, I think, Red Clydeside. What was going on at the time, the labour disputes in Glasgow and the west of Scotland in 1911, that it was, you know, it wasn't pretty. And I think here there's a sort of sublimation going on of the current threat of a rising a rebellion of the working class in the west of Scotland, and that maybe is part of the tone for that. And then finally, the quote I'm putting up there is somebody who is being moderate. He is anti-Jacobite, but he's fair and decent. And that sense keeps coming through, that fairness and decency was something that they were valuing highly. And a lot of the people who are described in the catalogue of historical portraits, this is something that's emphasised, how important that is as a characteristic. Empire clearly mattered. Some of it is the empire was so important that you don't need to say much, that it comes through in a few little glimpses. So the description of the portrait of Lord Bute describes him how he may claim to be a builder of our empire. And then the next bit is somebody commenting afterwards on the benefit of studying history, because Scottish history, clan history of primitive Scotland gave you ways of understanding other primitive people around the world. So back to that point I was making before about the West African settlement and the Highland settlement within the exhibition. There's an equation going on of these primitive people, and only by understanding their primitive ways of life can we rule them effectively. So that was one of the purposes of the exhibition. I'd mentioned there that in Aberdeen the Anthropological Museum was arranged in a sort of racial geographical order, and had the same idea, that it was so people would learn about the customs of the people that they were going to rule, so they could do it benignly and do it well. I mentioned Red Clydeside, the way that it's astonishingly invisible in the exhibition. There were two little sections, one on beggars' badges and one on the history of the poor law, which are more about ways of controlling the poor by the borough mercantile establishment rather than the experience of being poor. The experience of being poor just doesn't really appear in the exhibition. And Tom Johnson, who was one of the Red Clydesiders, went on to be Secretary of State for Scotland during the Second World War, and a major figure in Scottish politics, wrote that there was a book he wrote about our Scots noble families when he worked through them one by one, including the Duke of Atholl, and said how they were all thieves and brigands. Apparently in later life, Tom Johnson used to go around second-hand bookshops buying up copies of the book because he was embarrassed by his youth. But this is what he wrote in Forward, which was the socialist newspaper of the time. And he is saying there is huge bias. Now, this is one of the few times I can find in the Glasgow Herald, which was a conservative unionist paper at the time, didn't publish things like this. So that this voice is a very quiet voice. But quiet? Can you shout and be quiet? So he's emphasising what is missing from this exhibition. And finally, I think the bit that's prominent running throughout this is the sense of unionism. That there are various quotes through it, as well as these ones, which, when talking about pre-Union Scotland, talk about there being troublous times, talk about things being barbarous, and talk about scarcity and famine, and about the people being rude and rough. So Scotland pre-Union wasn't up to much. Post-Union, because of the Union, we were able to have the empire and industry and all that made Scotland great. So there's quite a clear message coming through of the value of union in this. I took the first quote because Brilla and Juliet Kinchin have written about the exhibition as a book that was published at the time of the Glasgow Garden Festival. And they noted that 1911, they said, devolution was the issue of the day, independence seemed within reach. And this was written in 1988. You think today, whatever. And this is where I really dispute this, that the people who were organising the exhibition may have been intensely patriotic, intensely proud of being Scottish. They were also intensely in favour of the Union. But the history that they were talking about was one which actually had very little Scottish history running through to the present. It was the history of Scotland. Scotland's history ended with the Union, and it then became British history. So, just to end with this, it was a very successful exhibition. It had over 9 million visitors. It raised £20,000, and that meant that they were able to endow a chair of Scottish history. And the first professor in that took up his post in 1913, and that was Sir Robert Raitt, who went on to be principal of the university in the early 1930s. His writing was exactly of this line. He wrote a lot about the run-up to the Union and the importance of the Union. He was of the same mind as the people who were putting together the exhibition. So in conclusion, I think it's interesting. It's not a very well-remembered exhibition. It's one that most people have forgotten. And I think that can basically be explained by, as I said earlier, World War I. But I think what it did was it confirmed a view of Scottish history that was prevalent then and continued right through until the latter part of the 20th century. The Scottish history, as written by Sir Walter Scott, saw it, Scottish history as something that was gone and dead and irrelevant to present-day Scotland. So I hope what I've done shows the value of looking at historiography, the writing of history, as a way of understanding what really mattered to people at the time. I think you get a feeling for what was going on in 1911, from what they chose to include, what they chose to exclude. And finally, I ask, would such a politically motivated exhibition be possible today? In the Museum of Scotland, given when it was done, the run-up to devolution and so on, there's a very careful avoidance of present-day politics, whereas this exhibition was intensely political. And I think that's an interesting thing, an interesting thing about where we're going now. Should we have politically motivated exhibitions? Note that this is one that was done by a group of businessmen. It wasn't done by the state. So they were maybe freer, but I suspect at that point there wouldn't have been much difference. So, thank you very much.